Hey guys, hope everybody's doing okay. So today we're going to be going over the PowerPoint on Renaissance. This PowerPoint's a little bit long, a little bit longer than the other ones, I should say. So hopefully you have something to drink. Make sure you have something to take notes with, etc. All right. So last thing we stopped on was the end of the Gothic period. We start seeing elements that somewhat naturalistic. I mean, we still have some abstraction on the figures, but naturalism is starting to come back. And that's what brings us into what we call now, or what we called the Renaissance. But before we go into the Renaissance, let's look at some of the time period we've seen. And I wanted to see it through this context, this view line of knowledge and intellectualism. So if we think about it, Greece is the top of knowledge and intellectualism. It's the height of all of that. Now, here's a map. So here's the area where understanding knowledge was so important. Rome, later on, basically takes on the same idealistic qualities of understanding, knowledge, and intellectualism and expands it throughout the Roman Empire. So, thought and knowledge were very much part of the culture. Now, as we all know, here happens year one, Rome starts declining, and eventually the Roman Empire splits. With the split of the Roman Empire, right, we have the Eastern and the Western Empire. Now, the main differences in these two cases is going to be based on religion. Even though it's the same Christian religion overall, then we have the Eastern Orthodox, which is going to be attached to the writing, and that's what Orthodox means. Orthodox just means that it's close to what is said in the writing, in the books. If you are an Orthodox cook, that means that in some ways you follow the recipe to the T. And that's what Orthodoxism kind of means in a general sense. Now, the other half right here, the Roman Catholics. And if you remember well, Roman Catholics versus Eastern Orthodox, the differences are based on the understanding of the importance of imagery. So Roman Catholics understood imagery as a way of teaching, as a way of expanding the knowledge of the writings and the teachings of God, while Eastern Orthodox were much closer to the concept of images being idols, and therefore you can pray or adore them. Very similar as to our cousins, the Muslims. Now, as we move forward, we get into the Middle Ages. So here it is. There's the Roman Empire, Eastern and Western Empire. The Eastern Empire becomes obviously our Byzantine Empire, while the other one right here in brown is going to be the Western Empire that no longer is part of the Roman Empire, but is where we see what we recognize as the Dark Ages. Now, on the concept of knowledge and understanding, one of the biggest things to understand is that when Christianism took over, no longer we were focused on expanding our knowledge and the understanding of the world and the world around us, but rather our understanding and our closeness to God and their Christian values, etc. Especially with the division here of Rome, right? Of the disappearance of Western Rome, right? Because you have all of these groups of individuals here who some of them are Christian, some of them are not, and they're all trying to take on power. So knowledge is not the most important of things. The Byzantine Empire expands, as we talked about in the past, right? The knowledge of the iconoclastic ideas, meaning the Eastern Orthodox not liking images expanded into the Roman Empire. And the reason why I have this slide is because it shows you here that there's the conflict between those who like images and do not like images. This is when Leo created the decree, right? So as we have the decree happens, it continues to expand and dilute the Byzantine Empire, and slowly, even with Theodora canceling in some way Leo's decree, eventually the Byzantine Empire collapses to just this area in the world. Keep in mind that all of these individuals are still in some way Greeks. All of these individuals still Roman. All of these individuals still part of that historical context. However, the difference between Greeks as this epitome of knowledge and this late Gothic period is 1,000 years plus difference on how we approach knowledge. In other words, it's 1,000 years of darkness, but I'll mention that later. So like I said, there were still Christian individuals here who believe in images, Christians in here who did not believe in the power of images. Here is what remains. But nevertheless, all of these individuals, all these people were part of the Roman Empire and the heritage. So with all that said, with that recap of where we've coming from as a culture in Europe, who are past, who our ancestors were in Europe in the past, brings us into what we now recognize, or what is known as the Renaissance. So what is the Renaissance? The Renaissance is mainly a shift of attitude, a way of changing the way we see ourselves in the world around us. We've had 1,000 years of teachings where God is the only answer to all our problems. In some ways, just like the Greeks saw that their gods were the ones who were the answer to their emotions and so forth and so on. For us, any question that there was as a Christian world, all the answers were based on God. However, in the Renaissance, this starts to change. One of the things that comes up is the understanding of ourselves, or philosophy. So philosophy is a study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence in an academic discipline. So we are somewhat doing the same thing the Greeks did on regards to understanding ourselves, who we are, why are we here, what is the concept of being a human person, what is the relationship to one person to another, what are emotions. Now the difference is that while Greeks answer a lot of those questions by creating a plethora, or not plethora, but a group of gods to answer those questions. In the Renaissance, that's not the case because we only have one God. So because we only have one God, this has to be a different reason behind this knowledge, this reality of existence, etc. However, regardless of how we approach this, as I mentioned just a minute ago, we're still looking at Greece and at Rome. We're still looking at our past. So the shifts of the Renaissance come in this kind of generalized group of things. So from God and life after death to the here and now. That is the main shift. Before, in some ways, we were living life like the Egyptians did. We live our lives according to how our lives after the death were going to be. However, in the Renaissance, we start to question that and say, well, we're living right now. We do not know what's going to happen later, so might as well focus on the here and now. And even though we are going to continue following the teachings of God and we're going to be good people, we're still going to preserve our lives and preserve our thoughts and preserve who we are as individuals. That concept of self-awareness of who we are as a person who bleeds, a person who feels, a person who is part of a community, is called humanism. A lot of times, I don't know if you've ever questioned yourself on why in universities, when they say the School of Humanities, right? Why is it that politics and art and philosophy and all of those kind of random things are part of the School of Humanities? Well, it's because of this concept of humanism. All of those things I just mentioned, politics, art, philosophy, even some ethics, things like that, dance, all of those things that study who we are as individuals within the context of society is humanistic, and therefore is part of the School of Humanities. So hopefully that answers a little bit of that question if you ever had that question in your mind. So what is humanism? So the importance to the human rather than to the divine or the supernatural. So to reiterate in some ways, we are worried about who we are right now. Your parents, your siblings, your family, your everyday, rather than being more focused on the supernatural, on the things you cannot have control over. The other very important thing to understand humanism and the Renaissance, and then this is kind of the key, the most important thing that is allowing us to move forward with the Renaissance. Up to this point, God has been this block of some ways to be able to allow us to think, because we were not able to read or write, so knowledge was really much pressed down. Somehow, and I will explain this later, things change. And now, after 1,000 years, which they've been telling us, God, you have been created in the image of God. Well, if I was created in the image of God and God gave me a brain, then I'm going to use my brain. I'm going to use what God gave me to understand the world better. So this is what this is all about. Using their God-given wisdom, humans can solve anything. So God gave me a brain, God gave me the ability to understand, to imagine, to do all these things. So if I don't use the brain God gave me, that's actually a bad thing. So the change of thinking, the way to see God rather than a punisher for thinking, but rather the reason for us to think, is a big part of the Renaissance. We no longer need to wait for a divine interception. So if our child was sick, we would try to do what's necessary to solve the sickness. We would go look for a doctor, and a scientific, humanistic, worldly way of solving that problem, while still praying for a miracle. But we're not going to just sit down and wait for the Virgin Mary to drop out of the sky and say heal, and wait for that to happen. We're not longer going to be completely dedicated to that is supernatural or divine. Now, some of the things that this concept allows to do is to expand our knowledge, therefore exploration. Right? So how is it that the discovery of the Americas happened? It's because of this expansion of understanding of the world around us, right? This kind of idealistic, limitless potential. If God is behind you, anything is possible, right? The sky is the limit, because if God is behind you, then nothing's impossible. So a huge change between the Middle Ages, and where God was the oppressor in so many ways, and the only thing we believed and saw was God, to now God giving us basically an eyes to the possibility of the universe. So that's the Renaissance, that awakening, that realization of understanding and knowledge that the Greeks had and the Romans also expanded, but was dormant for 1,000 years, and now all of a sudden we have light again. So one of the things to think about this rebirth, because that's what Renaissance means, this rebirth, is that in so many ways we had 1,000 years of darkness, and when we're looking back at this awakening and this realization of who we are, once again in concept of knowledge, okay, we're looking at the glory of ancient Greece, which is the highest point of Western civilization. Now, if you think about Greece versus Rome, Rome was much larger and much more powerful. So how is it that we call Greece the high point of Western civilizations, right? Why Greek and not the Romans? Well, pretty simple. The Greeks are the ones who came up with all the concepts regarding society and organization and the correct way of living and really understood the power of knowledge, right? The Romans enjoyed those ideals and they expanded upon them. They did not create them. So Greek in Greece Greece is kind of the highest point of understanding and intellectuality. So how is it? What happened? What happened so that all of a sudden, even though after 1,000 years, what was the key? What brought about this change? What brought about this understanding of our past? What is it that changed all these things? So what is the key? And the key to all of this is our Muslim brothers, our cousins, right? Islam as a religion, as an ancient religion, has kept the same idealistic concept as as Greek had. In other words, Muslims have always appreciated knowledge. I know that nowadays, in some cases, doesn't seem like it, but in the era of the Middle Ages, in the era of the Renaissance, the Islam and the Muslims were extremely progressive. They were open to concepts, to ideas, so much so that the Muslims and Islam collected information and expanded on that information. We have astronomy, we have geometry, we have the understanding of mathematics as we use them today, based on the teachings and the knowledge that the Muslims gathered and expanded on. There's a plethora of other things that we utilize today, are very mundane, however, were basically created and expanded by them as a group. Now, as people who acquired information, people who believed on the power of knowledge, the Greeks were a great source of information. So they acquired all the writings and the readings and the poetry and theatrics of Greece, and basically translated them or included them in their libraries and in their into their culture. So if you were to think about, and I'll show you this in a minute, let me show you to you right now. So here is the Byzantine Empire. So this is towards the end of the Middle Ages, as the Byzantine Empire slowly collapsed, and you see here is the Western Empire with all the divisions of the Western Empire through all the different kingdoms and so forth and so on. If you look around it, this right here is the Islam Empire. All of this right here. So all of this area had access to Greek concepts of understanding, Greek ideals, all of those things about understanding and knowledge. Well, slowly but surely, as they invaded in some ways Europe as a continent here towards Spain and Portugal, the Arabs changed. They translated back to Latin our own historical documents. So Greek works that talked about Plato, that talked about Aristotle, that talked about the importance of knowledge and so forth and so on, were being retranslated to us. They were being brought back to us. We started to understand that we had a much more full past when it came down to understanding of the world around us. So these ideas started slowly creeping back into our own culture, our own past brought in by the Islam Empire, by the Muslim Empire, slowly into Europe. And the change into the Renaissance, guys, did not happen overnight. The change over to the Renaissance took a long time for these concepts to slowly seep into culture and eventually kind of turn over the tide from kind of religion being a suppressant versus religion being our the thing that pushes the understanding and the knowledge. A lot of individuals were put to death because they were seen as sacrilegious, or all kinds of anti-religion because of these new ideas. So please keep in mind that this didn't happen overnight. This took a long period to happen, but nevertheless, it did happen. Now, with the appearance of the Renaissance, with this new way of thinking and a new fad of understanding the world, a new fad of where knowledge and creativity is the thing that everybody wants, and because that's what the world is now, right? God has anointed us with our brains, and then we can do anything we want. So we're going to be looking for those individuals who are the best at this way of understanding the world around them, learning the world around them, changing the world around them. And because of that, then we have the artist. So as I mentioned just a minute ago, these new values are happening of knowledge and so forth and on, included also new technologies. And whether it is technologies, whether it's new ideas, whether it is new ways of looking at society, all of those things were worth money. So artists were the individuals who helped create a lot of these new things and helped move a lot of the economy. And I'll explain that in just one second. Another thing about the artist is that this individual who was creating new things was not only creating things for facades or for decoration or embellishments. It was much more beyond that. So the artist was no longer attached to the architecture, and they were no longer anonymous. As I was mentioning before, these individuals created basically an industry, and the main thing that was part of this industry was knowledge. So creating new things, coming up with new technologies, coming up with a whole bunch of new things. So if you had a individual who was making you money, right, you wouldn't want to keep them silent, right? So if, let's say, for example, you were, I don't know if Tesla is the right kind of company, but think of a large company, and imagine that that company or that group had one person whose iconic name created a brand, right? So in this case, then we have Michelangelo brand, and we have Donatello brand, and we had all these brands that came with a specific sense of sensitivity to a specific kind of creativity, right? So we will see that in the Renaissance, these individuals created not only technologies, but they also created paintings, which were a new way of looking at things. They were creating all kinds of different things, and that's why they were no longer anonymous. Their name was very, very, very important because it was a brand, just like nowadays. So you have to understand that not everybody who was creative was an artist. There were two major criteria for somebody to be called an artist. First of all, you had to have creativity, the ability to come up with new ideas, the ability to create, to think of something that was beyond what the world had around them. The second requirement is to have the skills to be able to bring it to life. So there might be a lot of people who are good idea makers, people who are the ones who can imagine things, but they don't have the skill, hand skill, to create them, right? So if you have an idea for a machine that does X, Y, Z, but then you have no knowledge of physics or mechanics, then you cannot create it. So not really an artist. Or you can have the opposite, somebody that's can beautifully have great skill on working with wood or working with other sets of media, right? but then not the ability to create or come up with some idea that's fundamentally changes anything, right? So who is the artist? The artist is the one who has not only the ability to think, the ability to create things that were beyond the world or current world at that time, and the skill to bring them to life. Those were artists, and those who artists are those who have the ability and the knowledge to create the idea and the skill to make it happen. And they were actually considered geniuses. So artists and geniuses were basically the same thing. And the artist was only given, that label was only given to those individuals who were able to create and have the skill to create it. So art is basically an occupation. Being an artist was an occupation. You were part of the payroll as somebody else um, in a factory, right? So the artist was a person that a merchant will have in the payroll, and the merchant wanted the artist. The only thing they wanted to do is to think, come up with new ideas, new things, whether they are new technologies, new weapons, new ways of approaching subject matter. I mean, whatever it was. Now, they were paid exclusively to think and to create, right? The benefactors always, pay them as part of the roster. Why? Because whatever products these artists would come up with, then they can sell, right? So if it was a weapon, or if it was a technology, or if it was anything of that regard, then they can actually take that brand and sell it. So having an artist in your payroll was an investment. So it was an occupation, just like any other. Now, their job, as I mentioned, was to create, was to think and to create, nothing else. As we're looking at the Renaissance, we have to understand that the world itself is divided into two major groups, which we already talked about. We have the groups of people, the group of people who are descendant from the Western Roman Empire, right? Which are your Christians, which are iconophiles, which are the Roman Catholics, which are the people who understood that imagery was a way of telling a story, and it was very important on how the story was told. On the other side, then we have the iconoclasts, the ones who are much more relentless or much more careful, I should say, about how to approach imagery. So two different worlds, same Renaissance, different approach to the subject matter and to understanding of what Renaissance means. Now, on the Renaissance, you're going to see that instead of calling it East and West, we're going to call it North and South. And the reason for that is because the epicenter of the Renaissance as Roman Catholics, as Western Romans, let's put it this way, are going to be central here in what is Rome and what is going to be France and all of the southern space of Europe, while the other side, is going to be more northern. It's going to be more into the northern countries. So you will see that the Renaissance is not split into east and west, but rather from north to south or south north. Here we go. So the southern and the northern, what is the two major differences? The southern, right, these ones are more Byzantine and Greco-Roman. They're going to be much more attached to those concepts of creating imagery on a Byzantine and Greco-Roman style. And the northern is going to be much more Gothic. Southern are going to be human-centered. So we're going to look at how the world affects us individually as a person. Who are we in the big scheme of things? Our emotions, our approach to the world, and it's going to be very much me, right? And it's very idealistic, right? So we're looking at Greece, we're looking at Roman, then we're going to idealize our imagery. We're going to be idealistic. What is the best it can be, right? We're going to look at Greece, we're going to look at Plato, and we're going to come back to those ideas of of idealism, of beauty, right? Of this sense of the truth. On the northern side, because of the different approach to imagery, right? Because it's going to be much more Gothic, much more elaborate in some ways. But instead of being human-centered, it's going to be much more nature-centered. So it's more about the overall picture, the larger picture, and how we fit inside that picture. We as Christians, we as individuals, how we fit within the much larger picture. This kind of God is the center of everything, and how do we fit in there? So different approaches to the Renaissance. Now, both of these groups are all um, wanting and looking at knowledge knowledge and God as giving them power to think, but completely different ways of approaching it through the aesthetics. So as I mentioned before, the Renaissance didn't happen overnight, and we leave the Gothic period, and as we continue moving towards the Renaissance, there's a time period in between kind of late Gothic, if I may call it even that way, or early Renaissance, in where we can start seeing the slow resurgence of realistic representations. So the bodies are starting to look more naturalistic. They're not going to be as stylized. We're going to see them much more grounded to the real world rather than elevated with the feet pointing down, those kind of things. And one of the artists who we look into art history for an example of this early Renaissance or late Gothic is going to be Giotto. So here's an image, a fresco by Giotto. Hopefully you automatically see that the human figures seem to be in fairly good proportions, proportional to each other, proportion to parts to the whole. Overall, somewhat naturalistic, much more naturalistic than Gothic for sure. Look at their feet; they're going to be much more naturalistic rather than pointing down, and so forth. So here's the next evolution away from Gothic and Middle Ages ways of depicting the figure. So as I mentioned earlier, the Renaissance, the epicenter of the Renaissance is going to be in the south, Italy, Rome, Florence, those kind of locations, Venice. And one of the things to understand with the southern approach to the Renaissance is how connected it is to Greek ideals, to Greek concepts of aesthetics, Greek concepts of beauty. So just like the Greeks, we're looking at a close evaluation of nature, right? We're looking at the human body, how it moves, how the muscles work, how the eyes work, how everything works, especially since we are wanting the knowledge of everything, basically, right? How animals, grow, how plants and flowers open up, things kind of that in that nature. So it's a very close attention to nature and anatomy through kind of the lens of Platonic ideas of beauty. Also, geometry is very, very important. We saw that in Greek period regarding the golden mean and kind of this mathematical infusion into the real world. And so you will see exactly the same thing here. Actually, it's slightly much more precise in some ways. And the other thing that's extremely important is linear perspective. So linear perspective finally becomes a thing. So linear perspective is extremely important, as I mentioned in another PowerPoint, because linear perspective allows you to do triangulation. So if you want to create an object with linear perspective in a flat surface, in a piece of paper or whatever, by triangulation, you can recreate that same object in real life just by following measurements and things like that. So it's an extremely important achievement in order for us to find technologies and to recreate technologies. Now, keep in mind, last time we got really close to seeing linear perspective was 1,000 years. Basically, when we finished the PowerPoint on Rome, the last slide when I showed you guys that fresco where the linear perspective was somewhat there but not quite there yet, right? So that's 1,000 years of not understanding or not focusing on this important technologically advancement of portraying images in flat space where you can actually recreate them. So that's 1,000 years. So I want you to think about this real quick. You know, if we're talking about 100 years ago, today, 100 years ago today, we basically barely had airplanes. We did not have computers. Cars were extremely basic, right? So think about 100 years ago. Now, take where we're at right now and expand that to 1,000 years in the future. What kind of technologies do we think there would be 1,000 years from now? If you take that and you think about the 1,000 years that were lost between the end of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance, is how much far behind we are as a globe in technology, which is mind-blowing. So anyways, regardless, I'm glad that the Renaissance happened. And that's also part of the reason why it's called the Middle Ages, or the Middle Ages, or not the Black Years. I'm trying to think. Anyways, it's because the age between the ages of thinking and the age of Renaissance. So that's the Middle Ages. Okay, so let's look at this early Renaissance piece as well, from what we now consider the full-on Renaissance, but towards the early years. It's a fresco. Okay, and here we have basically all the elements that talks about Renaissance and gives us examples of what the Renaissance is about. So we'll start from the top and we'll go down. Mosaico. Okay, so here's the top. The most important thing. So the most important thing in the Renaissance is God. And it has been for a long time, but in this case, God is the one who gives us the power. Now, if you look at this imagery right here, yes, we have Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, but it's extremely important to see this character right here. If she is, the Virgin Mary is looking at us straight on and is somewhat inviting us to be participant of God, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Gives us, in some ways, access to them. That's very much part of the Renaissance, right? That He is in some way our Father, where we are created in His image, and therefore, once again, we are thinkers, and we are who we are because of that sacrifice and because of Him. So, very simple way, but dramatic at the same time. The other part I want to notice, I want to show in this fresco, are these two figures right here. These two figures are the benefactors. These are the people who paid for the mural, for the fresco. Now, how is that important? Well, we just discussed that this time period, knowledge was basically a commodity. Was something, knowledge and understanding and creativity and all of those things was a commodity. And artists were a big part of that concept, right? So these two individuals right here who paid the artist to create this in the church wanted themselves in there, right? I mean, it would be just like putting a logo on, or on Dickies Arena, for the matter of fact, right? It's called Dickies Arena because you want people to know that that's Dickies who pay for the arena, right? Or the American Airlines Center, same thing. So in the same concept, in the same way, this is saying these two individuals, or this murals was brought to you by these two individuals, right? They are the ones who are hiring Masako to paint this mural, and is very much a part of the Renaissance. And last but not least is this, which is very iconic. This is a skeleton, right? And it's a writing right here in Latin, right? And I'm going to translate it to English. And it says, I was what you are, and what I am, you shall become. This is the best way of showing that we are human and that we all our fates are exactly the same. None of us get away from this one. We're born, we grow up and we reproduce, and when we die, every single one of us will eventually have the same outcome. So this is our humanity. This is the most basic of ways of creating this generalization about humanism. So all of the elements in this mural point directly to concepts of the Renaissance. And last but not least, the new technology, the new fad, whatever you want to call it, of new point of 1-point perspective. All right. So we have the anatomy. Northern Europe. Northern Europe slightly different, as I mentioned already. Northern Europe is more about life in the real world, things that surround us and how we are part of it. And in northern Europe, it says that it's the invention of oil paints, and it's not really quite the invention of oil paints. It's what makes it popular, because oil paints kind of existed anyways already, but Northern Europe and Northern Renaissance is what makes them popular. And the person who really pushes this quite a bit is going to be Jan van Eyck. So Jan van Eyck is a merchant, makes a lot of money, and because he's able to buy the materials he wants and he wishes to use as an artist, then he uses oils and very expensive pigments, and he's able to utilize all those elements to create this beautiful, vibrant paintings in the Northern Renaissance. So think about it. So if I am a merchant as well, but I don't paint, however, I have an artist in my payroll, and I want a similar painting, right? And I'll go to my artist and I ask, hey, would you like to have a set of oil paints? I will pay for the oil paints. I want you to paint me a painting with the oil paints. And the artist, of course, are like, why not? It's beautiful materials. I don't have to pay for it. It'd be great. Sure. So, this merchant, me as a merchant, gets the paints, give it to the artist. My next door neighbor is another merchant. And guess what? He wants to have his artists have oils too, and so forth and so on, until it just becomes a fad, right? So Jan van Eyck did not invent oils. He just, by creating artworks with oils that were beautiful and vibrant, just created a fad of the use of oils as a form of, not as a form, but as kind of what everybody wanted to use at that point for portraiture and for paintings. So let's look at this specific image of this specific painting from the Northern Renaissance. It's very iconic. And one of the things to keep in mind is that this, once again, is not about us. It's not about the individual. It's not about how we how we feel or how we are altered by the world around us, but rather how we fit within that world. So a lot of symbology comes in these paintings, a lot of not superficial, but all the elements in the painting here are going to be relevant to these two individuals or to what's happening here. So for example, we have this one single candle. If you notice, only one single candle there, right? So that would be the presence of God, of Christ in their lives, the light, right? Here's some beads and the light from the window. That means purity. The next one's going to be the dog, which means fidelity. And then the green is going to be fertility, which, sorry guys, is not there. Let's see. It shows up fertility. Nope. Sorry. There's supposed to be the word fertility here. So fidelity for the dog, and then fertility for the color green. And then the other one right here is her hand holding the cloth up to her belly as if she was pregnant to give a willingness to bear children. It looks like she was pregnant here. It looks like she has a belly, but she does not. How do we know she's not with child? Simple, because nobody that's a good Christian in this time period would bear child before being married. And this is a wedding picture. So there is no way that this person is married. Now, she is pregnant, I mean. So in this case, what you're seeing is she's pulling her dress up in such a way that looks like she has a belly as if she was pregnant, but she is not. It's just a way of portraying a willingness to bear children. And the last but not least is the last two objects in the back, which is going to be a mirror and the signature of the artist. Very important, right? So it's like a logo, it's like a brand. It is a couple of things. One, that it gives importance to whoever purchases, owns this artwork, because it is, right, a product in so many cases. And also at the same time, it gives a sense of a witness as well of what's happening, especially during elements like this one, or paintings like this one, where you're portraying an individual. So all of the things I just mentioned, all of those things are parts to a whole, right? They're nothing specific about me, nothing specific about him, nothing specific about her. It's not about her feelings, it's not about, the relationship. It's kind of the overall elements and how they're all part of what's going on right here. Another extremely important thing to understand is that the Protestant movement started happening right about 1521, right through the middle of the Renaissance. That creates a shockwave throughout the Christian world. Now, why is the Protestant movement happening? To be very simplistic about it, because of this Renaissance, because of this new way of thinking, God in so many ways, it is not seen as the answer to all our questions. It's no longer that. And for some Christians, that understanding of knowledge versus God was not the best. So some believe that Christianity was going in the wrong direction, that there has to be some kind of more pure version, much more, not even orthodox, but much more cleaner version in some ways of the Christianity. And therefore that's when you have Luther nailing the nails on the door, and the Protestant movement beginning. And that's going to create another issue, not issue, but that's what's going to move things different later on into the Baroque, and we'll talk about the Baroque next time. With Protestant idealism, then you have the discouragement of elaborate interiors. It is kind of a midpoint between, the iconoclastic concepts of the Eastern Orthodox, right? And then an opposite way of looking at Catholics and Western, Christians. So they discourage elaborate interiors, a lot of very decorative interiors. So this is the kind of things that you would see, the kind of artwork you would see in the Northern Renaissance. If you notice here, there's not a story or is not specific about this individual or specific about these two individuals right here. It's about kind of the presence of God all the way through the whole rather than the individual. And hopefully at this point this will make a little bit more sense. I've shown you guys this painting before when we're talking about art as a way of persuasion, right? If you did any of the things from here on earth, you will never make it to heaven. You will instead go to hell, right? So hopefully at this point it makes sense why it is painted the way it is, right? So this is not specifically about you, it's not specifically, well, in some ways it is about you, but it's much more contextualized in a much more general world, right? If you do any of these things within the context of this painting, right, then what are the choices, right? If you do any of that, then you go to hell. If you do any of, if you don't do, then you go to heaven, type of thing. Especially with the new Protestant ideals that are happening at this point. And Bosch was definitely a Protestant, and this makes a lot more sense, right? So it is how you fit in this world. It's not just specifically about you or the story of one single person. All right. All right, so let's talk about High Renaissance. We talked about early Renaissance. We talked about the difference between Northern and Southern Renaissance. Now let's talk about High Renaissance. And this is where we start talking about the Ninja Turtles. So the first thing to understand about the High Renaissance is that the nude is back. We have not seen any nudes since we saw Rome. And so finally the nude is back. And what does that mean? So what it means is that when you portray the human body in its nude form, then you're creating a new sense of the Christian content, meaning God has created you in his vision, in its own form. So if we are created in the form of God, then it's perfection, right? So there's no reason why you should be ashamed of what God has given, right? And the other thing about the human body being nude is that a human body that is nude, that moves, that is beautiful, that is perfect, has the ability to be evidential of the existence of a soul, right? So if a body it's moving, if the body looks to be expressing emotion, if the body any of those things, then there is evidence in there of soul rather than just a stone or a piece of glass or whatever, right? So all those things were very important. Christianly contextualize on why the nude was an important step into the Renaissance. And here's where we start, like I mentioned earlier, with the Ninja Turtles, and we start basically with the first one, Donato de Niccolo di Bettobardi. Now, we do not call him by any of that. We just call him Donatello. We call it Donatello, pretty simple, because his dad was also Donato. So this is basically a way of saying Donato Jr. in Italian. Some Latin languages have diminutives, like in Spanish, ito or ita. In Italian, sorry, you also have ello and ella. So Donatello just means small Donato, rather than his whole other name. Here's a very well-recognized sculpture by Donatello. Okay, so this is Donatello's David. And as you're looking at this imagery, there's a few things that I want you to keep in mind as I'm talking about this. One is going to be that the Renaissance ideals were based on Greek ideals, right, and Roman ideals, right? So as we're looking at these images, think of Greeks and how Greeks approach the human body, right? So Greeks approach the human body as in a Platonic idea, meaning that is without flaws, right? So there's no flaws on this figure. It's portrayed with youth, and obviously this is a very young David. What other elements here gives us a sense of Renaissance, right? The fact that it's nude, right? Also, it's a very important element of the Renaissance and Greece. And as we're looking at this imagery, I don't know what else comes into mind, but also think about other elements that attach it to classicism. right? So we have all those ideas of beauty. Um, Now, one of the things that I want you to recognize in here is the subject matter. So David, hopefully you guys know the story of David from the Bible. And basically the story of David is that, you have Goliath, which is a massive uh, individual, and he is part of a war, let's put it that way. And then we have David, which is the other side, and in order to avoid massive deaths, then they put one man from each side to fight. And of course it is Goliath and David's a very small person. Anyways, David, with just one single stone or rock, defeats Goliath. He throws it, hits him on the head, Goliath collapses, and then David beheads him. To make a long story short. Anyways, why David, and why in the Renaissance? Well, in the Renaissance, Donatello was asked to create an image, an icon for the city of Florence. And Florence had been sieged by much larger enemies, but has always been able to stay Florence without changes, and has kept all these enemies away. So Donatello decided to use David as his icon for the Renaissance. For Florence. Now there's an underground iconography for David as well. What is the other possible correlation between a Goliath and a David in the context of the Renaissance? And that is religion and knowledge. This concept of this oppressor, right? And then this new way of looking at things, and how this new approach to understanding has defeated this really large, powerful element in the world. So David becomes, in some ways, also a symbol, an underground symbol for the Renaissance. And those who were paying, those who were had artists left and right were the merchants, and some of the most powerful individuals in Florence, Rome, Venice, Paris. There were these really large families, and one of the most iconic families of Italy were the Medicis. So you can probably watch TV shows about the Medicis. There's a couple of Netflix, I believe, some really good ones. But anyways, families who had a lot of power, a lot of money, and power within the ranks of the Catholic faith, were people who were mainly merchants and bankers, as I just mentioned, but they were also Neoplatonist philosophers, or like these Neoplatonic ideals, the ones that we have been discussing. So philosophy was very important, meaning how, once again, we understand ourselves in a contemporary context of the world. They also understood the need for artists, the creators, the ones who develop new things and expanded our knowledge of the universe. Historians, the history on where we come from and where we're going, right? We are descendants of the Greeks and the Romans, and that's the direction we have to understand where we're coming from, and where we're going, right? Especially when we had Islam and Muslims kind of following that tradition. Now we do so as well ourselves. So one of the things that I like to point out is this quote from the book, and it says, "For the Medicis, inspiration or revelation, whether from the Bible or classical mythology, are means of ascending from earthly existence to mystical union with the divine." In so many ways, in so many words, this is Thomas Aquinas as well. The more you understand, the more you learn, the more you acquire this knowledge, whether it's from the Bible, whether it's from mythology, whether it's from any of those elements, it's going to ascend you, or it's going to grow you, right, of who you are as a person, and eventually it's going to get you closer to God. So an amazing way of looking at the world. So they're the ones who are paying and having artists in their payrolls are the ones who are pushing these new technologies and these new ways of thinking. Here's another artist from the Renaissance. This is not one of the kind of most recognized ones. Well, it is, but it's not kind of as popular as Michelangelo, Donatello, Raphael, those kind of guys. But nevertheless, is one that we've seen before. So this is Botticelli. Botticelli is the same artist that we saw earlier on this in art history, or actually at the beginning of the semester when we're talking about temperas and those paintings with the really bright red pants. Same artist. So when you're looking at this painting, there's something in particular that is very different from all the paintings we've seen after the collapse of Rome. And hopefully you can recognize the fact that this painting, it is not Christian at all. Everything after Rome that we've seen had a context of God, of Jesus, of Mary, of Christian elements. Here, none of it is part of the concepts of religion. Everything here is much more about Greece and Rome, and they're obviously the gods. And so a new way of thinking, a new way to approach, especially with Greek and Roman mythology. One element that I love in this case, and I didn't notice before and a student pointed it out, I love the fact that the nude is very much a part of the Renaissance, and you have this individual trying to cover beauty, cover the elements of Aphrodite or Venus, right? And then you have here this god coming here and blowing it away, keeping her as beautiful and pristine as she is. Very much concepts of the Renaissance. So, as we continue on, I want you to notice that Raphael, Michelangelo, Leonardo, all of these guys did not live basically at the same time. Some of them did, but not all of them did. So here's Raphael, and I want you to notice that Leonardo da Vinci is a few years later on. And for da Vinci, Greek ideals were very, very important. He followed this concept of calm, balance, idealism. All of those things are Platonic concepts. We've already seen them. We already talked about them when it came down to Rome and to Greece. So all of those elements are part of the concept of the Renaissance, especially when Leonardo da Vinci approached the Renaissance. The other part of it that we talked about is Christianity and Greek philosophy being very much parts of the way we understand the world. So Christianity, obviously, God, there's only one God. However, Greek philosophy allows us to understand ourselves philosophically. And the approach, especially in the approach of aesthetics. This is the quote that I find myself very much attached to in my own perspective of art. And this is where I get my ideas of comparing art to science and art to other ways of studies. And it says art and science are two means to the same end, right? So we all are discovering, asking questions and finding solutions to different answers. Now, some of them in art are much more abstractual, are much more based on aesthetics, philosophy, just those kind of things. Science is much more factual, obviously, right? It's based on the atoms and biology and all these other things. But nevertheless, there's it's all with the same end, which is knowledge and understanding of ourselves. As I mentioned earlier, the Renaissance and the artists were not just people painting pretty little things or creating decorative objects. That is not really at all what it was about. What it was about is understanding and knowledge. So Leonardo da Vinci is one of those true thinkers of this time period who studied understood the world around him and created things by understanding that world. So he would spend a lot of time, like in this case, um, figuring out how things work. And here we have the human body, right? And he did the same thing with all kinds of different things around him. And because of his understanding of the human body, because of his understanding of the world around him, is that this specific image is so important. Unfortunately, the Mona Lisa is somewhat of a Kardashian of sorts. And the reason why I said this is because a lot of times people think of the Mona Lisa as this famous artwork just because it's famous, period. Nobody really truly understands the reason why she's famous, right? So why is she famous? Why is this portrait, this really silly, mundane portrait of this woman so famous? What is it that makes it such an important element in the world of art? There's a few things that you have to understand, and they come from some of those myths of the Mona Lisa, like the smile, for example. What's going on with the smile? Well, it's pretty simple. One of the things that you have to understand about Leonardo da Vinci, and I can point out here, is that he studied the anatomy, how our muscles work, how our eyes work, how our body worked. So because our eyes are curved lenses, when we focus on one specific point, the lines that are horizontal do not remain horizontal. They actually curve because it is in a curved glass. So just if you ever had a line, or take a pencil and put it behind a glass, the line of the pencil curves slightly, right? So our eyes have exactly the same problem because they're not flat lenses, they're curved lenses. Now, with that understanding, he painted the Mona Lisa's mouth in such a way that when you're staring at it directly, the mouth is straight. When your eyes go away from it, then they slowly change, or they slightly change, therefore creating the enigmatic smile that nobody can see, or that you can see periodically, etc., etc. That's what he was doing. He was creating something, a some kind of a trick of sorts, not really a trick, but showing that he can make this, bodiless object, this paint, come to life in some ways, right? The idealism of the Greeks, right? Wanting the body to move by understanding our own biology, the way our eyes are, and also understanding by creating the face in a specific way with the muscles of the face just in such a manner that it creates a sense of a smile. That is why this painting is such an important painting. The research that went into understanding ourselves in a biological way in order to create something new. Other elements in this painting, for example, the because we're only able to either pay attention to one side or the other side, our field of focus can be in here, or the field of focus can be in here. Some of the elements in this whole image are out of proportion, from this side to that side, creating a sense of proportion altogether. Our minds creates that for us. The last thing about it is who she is. Who is she? She's a mundane individual, or not mundane, but she's, somebody that he knows, part of his acquaintances. It's nobody special, so it's not a religious icon. It is not a Greek icon. It is not portrayed in idealistic concepts of Roman, of Greek context. She's just an everyday person. It's just an everyday person, the everyday person, and that in so many ways is very contemporary, right? It's very much something that is far ahead of the Renaissance, of what the Renaissance is at this point. The last thing to understand is that the Mona Lisa was just a study. It was a part of a series of paintings, most likely. It was just a way of him understanding the human body, a way of him understanding paint, perspectives. It was just research in so many different ways. And And that is something that's also very important in the concept of art, is that art is not, or an artwork is just not this monolithic thing, but it's part of a process, right? Here's another Mona Lisa. You see, so this is just part of a series of a way of understanding the subject matter and so forth. So that's the Mona Lisa. It's not famous just because of all the different things that have been made up about her, like she is, Leonardo da Vinci in drag, or any of those silly things. Whether true or not, that's not really the reason why she's so popular or so important. It's because of all these other concepts that together are in one single painted, completely well represented on a time period where knowledge and the growth of the human mind was such an important, so important. It's funny. You're gonna go see it, and this is actually what you get to see. That is the reality of when you go see the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa is one of those paintings, honestly, that you get to see it better here. This is a much better way to show the Mona Lisa, for you to experience the Mona Lisa, than when you go to the Louvre. However, it's just like being in the same room as with a very famous person. You just kind of feel the aura of the painting, right? So nevertheless, you're not able to enjoy it like you just did in the PowerPoint, but being around it is something that's extremely, extremely, extremely cool. Now, this is much more Renaissance. If we were to think about what the Renaissance was about, this is much more Renaissance, much more specific to that. So this is also Leonardo da Vinci, and this is the Last Supper, right? We have all the elements of the Renaissance. We have individuals here from Rome, right? Because Jesus lived in the Roman period, so right, we have Rome, and we have the context of the one-point perspective, right? So one-point perspective. And all of the other things that you would expect from the Renaissance in here. It's not at all like the Mona Lisa in some cases, right? This was paid to him to be created for a church, actually for a chapel, etc. One of the things that I find interesting is that most people think of the full image right here as a full table, but nobody really pays attention to this object here. See that? Well, the reason why that object is there, because that is a doorway. Right? That's a doorway. So this is where the chapel where the Last Supper was originally painted at. This is what it looks like. Verona, outside of Florence. Right. So here it is. Now another thing to know about the Last Supper is the Last Supper was actually painted over. There was another fresco on top of it. And when that fresco was refurbished, and the way that it's refurbished, when you refurbish a fresco, is you basically peel it off of the wall, then you fix it, and then you put it back up. When they peeled the other fresco out, then they recognized that there was another painting underneath, and that's when they found this one. So that's another painting by Leonardo da Vinci. Right there. Okay. The next artist of the Renaissance is Michelangelo. Now, there's a big difference between Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. Leonardo da Vinci was very much a recluse. He's kept to himself, very quiet. Michelangelo, completely the opposite. He loved the attention. He loved being an artist. He loved being in the spotlight. And he kind of had a big head. He exploited that to not really work closely with their church. He kept to himself, and very popular guy. Anyways, regardless of that, he some of the most iconic imagery we can find, or artworks that we can find from Michelangelo, is going to be this one, which is another David. So this is David number 2 from the Renaissance. Now, if we look at this David and the other David, we will see there's some differences and some similarities. So when you talk about similarities, we're going to see they're both nude. Um, they're both young, but not as young, right? This one is a little bit more mature. It's a little bit more grown up. It's a lot more, um, uh, what you call it, like it knows what it's doing, right? Now, other differences that we see between the other one and this one, or sorry, another similarities that we see is idealization of the body. So once again, we have idealistic context from Greek period that approach in both of them. Another thing that we didn't talk about, I forgot to point out on the previous David and this one, is they both have contrapposto. So contrapposto kind of giving the sense of movement to the body. Now, while the one from Donatello had contrapposto, he looked very much done, right? He was complete. He had beheaded Goliath. He was just kind of posing for a picture. There's no more sense beyond that. This one by Michelangelo is slightly different, and that comes from the chronological point that he chose to create this David. So this David has not thrown the rock yet. He has not won the battle yet. He is in the process of going to battle, right? So he's got his rock in one hand and he has the sling on the other one. And the difference between this one and the other one as well is that we can empathize in some ways with what he might be thinking, right? We could feel in some ways the anxiety of having to face such a large foe and you know those kind of issues. So we can almost see his gears or his emotions going, which in some sense, if you remember the reasoning from putting for the Renaissance is to create the nude in the Renaissance is to give a sense of the spirit, right? So we can see the spirit on this creation, or allude to the sense of the spirit because the spirit is God, right? So the presence of the spirit is the presence of God. Um, and that's basically about it. The other thing is that you have to notice, or not notice, but the other things you have to know is that this artwork is out of proportion. Not terribly, but it's out of proportion, and it is meant to be seen from the bottom up. So as the columns from Greek were altered to kind of offset our own perspective and to change the realities in order for reality to be more real than it really is because of our eyes, this sculpture does too. So some of the things in the body change in order to kind of avoid some of those visual illusions. Right. So here's the comparison between the younger, much more, in some way, feminine approach by Donatello versus Michelangelo's, both with the contrapposto and so forth and so on. Another thing that you'll see a difference here is going to be materials. This is very much Greek and Roman in regards to the use of the white marble. While this one is a much smaller sculpture. This sculpture is only about 3 feet high. This one is a good 15 feet tall. And of course, we cannot stop talking about Michelangelo without the Sistine Chapel. So the Sistine Chapel, most of it was created or painted by Michelangelo. The back wall, back mural right here, or fresco, as well as the ceiling, the full ceiling is all painted by Michelangelo. Here's a kind of breakdown of what the ceiling has. So it's a massive ceiling, whole bunch of imagery that includes, you know, like it says right here, it says God creates Eve, God creates Adam. So basically the Old Testament. So we have especially the very first books of the Testament. So we have Noah's histories, we got the creation of the earth and the heavens and so forth and so on right here in the center. And then around we have the family of Jesus, we have the Sibley's and the prophets around as well, and so forth and so on. So all of these things, there's a whole bunch of information here. And my question is, with as many images on this ceiling, on that are decorating this really large space, how come do we focus so much on that one, right? How come do we focus on that one? Because it's not even the central piece, right? And it's just painted with the same detail as everything else. So why, oh why, is this part of the whole ceiling the one that we always look at? Why is this such an important painting, right? Similar to the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa is just one of so many paintings by Leonardo da Vinci, and now we know why. So the same reason here. Why is it that this specific painting is such an important painting, right? Well, and to be much more specific, why this, right? Right? Why that specific? Why is that such an important thing, right? Well, if you think about the Renaissance and you think about the new concepts of and ideas of the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance is the awakening and giving us, it's God giving us the power to think and to be ourselves. Humanism, right? And we wanted, or Michelangelo wanted to put this basically as a evidence, right? The Renaissance and the fact that God is the one who himself gave us the right to think. This is the moment, this is the evidence, even though it's not really a picture, but he's creating this painting as an evidential case to show that God himself gave us humans the right to think, our own destiny, our own ways of understanding the world, and it is because God himself gives us that. So this moment right here, that is basically the reasoning behind the Renaissance, right? So this is why this painting is such an important painting. It's because this is the evidence of the Renaissance. Now, it's funny to think about it because, go back for a minute, right? This is where the painting is at, right here. And this is the same room where the Pope gets elected. So if you think about also David and the kind of the push and pull between, religion and knowledge and all those things, right? It is really interesting to know that this image right here of God giving human or men or us the power to think and to evolve mentally and intellectually, it's right there on the top of the ceiling. It's all in one. Now, another thing to look at, and I think that's fine, really interesting, is Eve. She is here as well. So not only Adam is here, but also it's Eve. And she is right here, waiting to be born, right in the hand of God, right there. Another thing to think about, right, is God, the portrayal of the image of God. I want you to think that for Christians in general, praying to false idols is a sin, right? So looking at this individual, this image of this old man, and praying to this old man specifically, it's a sin, right? Now praying to God is not, but praying to an idol is. So how do we get away from praying to this icon, not icon, to this image, to this idol, right? How is it that we as Christians get away with it? Well, if we go back to when Christianity happened, or Christianity expanded, and we were simplifying images, right? We were creating icons or a symbol that would represent either a person or a thing, right? Especially a person. in order for us to avoid to pray idols. So what would be the most iconic image, right, that we can use as a placeholder for our own God? Well, simple enough. We can look at Rome and Greece, right? And we can basically utilize the image of their most powerful God as a placeholder for our own. So basically, when we look at our depiction, the Christian depiction of God, we're basically looking at a imagery of Zeus and Jupiter. We're not really looking per se at God, because praying to that image as God would be a sin, but rather we're using this imagery from history, from Rome and from Greece, as a placeholder for what we consider to be God, this concept of God. So that's why God himself looks like Zeus or Jupiter. Interesting, huh? All right. Last but not least, here, the back wall. Okay, this is going to be the Sistine Chapel's Last Judgment. And with the Last Judgment, it's pretty simple. Michelangelo did not get along with the church very well. He did not want to create artwork for the church, because the people who worked with him, or basically hired him, were very powerful, and part of their family was part of the church. Then eventually he was pushed into creating artworks for the church, and he got paid and all this thing. So he wasn't completely bad, but he didn't do it willingly as all the artists would. This is one of the artworks that he created, obviously for the Catholic Church. One of the fun things about this particular artwork is that in those who are suffering, those who are going to hell here, there are some people that did not get along with Michelangelo quite well, so he painted them on the area of suffering, including, I believe, some bishops or some people from the Catholic religion. All right. Last but not least, we're going to talk about the most, I would say, pure Renaissance artist, which is going to be Raphael. To me, Raphael is the most iconic, clearly Renaissance directed artist. Most of his artwork was very much clear on Renaissance ideals of knowledge and a combination of Roman and Greek aesthetics and concepts of theology and philosophy. He was very much in tune with a lot of those things, and you can see it through his artwork. This one's a beautiful example of the combination of everything I just mentioned. We've seen this before. This is the School of Athens. And we can see, obviously, as we mentioned before, this is one-point perspective, so he's using all of the elements from the Renaissance, technologically speaking, but also concepts of knowledge, right? So here's Plato and Aristotle having a discussion in the center of the room, concepts of knowledge. And here's the other part, which is on religion. So this is a tapestry, one of many tapestries that actually hang also in the Sistine Chapel. So here's the Sistine Chapel, and I want you to notice here on the sides that those are tapestries that were created by Raphael, and those still hang right there. So this is one of the tapestries, and this is actually one of the cartoons, one of the drawings or paintings from the tapestries. Here we have Paul preaching at Athens, and if we were to think about Renaissance ideals, right, we have education, teaching, right? Where are they at? They're in Athens, which is the center of knowledge, right? However, we also have here the Pope himself, right? And who's teaching, right? Paul is preaching, Paul is teaching. The combination of education, knowledge, Christianity, philosophy, all of those things that were very much the Renaissance pulled together to create an artwork that showcased that time period. And that's basically it. The only thing I did not mention that I just thought about, guys, is, if I may real quickly go back to David right here, is to also consider that this David was placed in the center of the city of Florence, still the same icon and symbol of Florence, but at the same time, the defiant view in the center square, right across from the church, the defiant view of Michelangelo in some way as a Renaissance artist in the era of the Renaissance, is always to keep in mind um, when it comes to the Renaissance. So all of these elements have in some ways dual meaning, both in the areas of knowledge but also the areas of Christianity. And I believe that covers